It all started with a rumble that shattered the desert silence. A deep, visceral impact that, even miles from the epicenter, made the windows of the hospital rattle in their frames. And then the sky to the east, out past the barbed wire and minefields of the forbidden Zone 51, blazed a sickly, pulsating crimson for a single, terrifying moment. We, the staff at Nevada Med, were used to training exercises, to the roar of fighter jets, to strange lights in the night. But this was different. This was the shriek of matter being ripped apart, the herald of a chaos about to descend upon us. The sirens began to wail almost instantly, their piercing cry mingling with the distant, fading echo of the explosion. The air, even inside the conditioned confines of Nevada Med, changed in a subtle way. It filled with the faint scent of ionized air and something burnt, metallic. My usual morning rounds, checking the IV drips for a couple of soldiers with food poisoning, and rebandaging a clumsy technician's sprain, all of it turned to dust in 15 minutes. First, the order for high alert crackled over the radio, then a warning to prepare for mass casualties. And then, all hell broke loose right at our doors. The first military transports and medical trucks roared onto the hospital grounds, leaving bloody tire tracks on the asphalt. They weren't unloading bodies, they were dumping them. Moans, screams, ragged breaths. The linoleum of the ER, usually a sterile beige, quickly became slick with blood. I, Nurse Anna Keller, a 5-year veteran of Army medicine who had seen my share of field hospitals overseas, felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. But there was no time for reflection. "Keller, get to OR 3 now. I need help with triage," barked Major Grant, our chief surgeon, his normally pristine white coat already splattered with something dark. I nodded, grabbed the tablet with the patient chart I'd just started, and ran where his shaking hand pointed. The patient load, which had seemed laughably light an hour ago, one case of mild pneumonia and a suspected appendicitis, had multiplied tenfold, if not more. 10, 12, 15 patients per nurse, and every one of them was severe, if not critical. Burns so bad the skin was charred to the bone, shrapnel wounds with fragments of unknown origin sticking out, concussions that sent people into violent seizures without ever regaining consciousness. The hospital, designed for 100 beds in peacetime, was now an overflowing anthill of panic. We were short on everything: staff, gurneys, blood for transfusions, even basic bandages. Doctors, usually collected and cool-headed, darted through the halls with wild eyes, shouting orders that were lost in the cacophony of suffering. The sharp, acrid smell of antiseptics mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent of fresh blood, and that same faint but pervasive smell of char that seemed to have soaked into the very fabric of reality. Vital signs monitors beeped in a horrific symphony of despair. Gurney wheels screeched on the floor as orderlies cursed, trying to shove their way through the wounded who were now sitting and lying directly on the floor. Maybe 3 hours of this madness passed. I'd applied a dozen tourniquets, started at least as many IVs, and assisted with an emergency tracheotomy right in the hallway because the operating rooms were full to bursting. My hands were shaking with fatigue, my vision blurring, but adrenaline kept me going. At one point, the head nurse, Wallace, a woman nearing retirement with a face etched with permanent exhaustion, pulled me aside. "Anna, take 5. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Go to room 7B. There's a new arrival, just pulled from the wreckage. His condition is, well, you'll see. He's under special observation. An order from Colonel Pierce. Room 7B turned out to be a small room that had probably once been a linen closet. It had been hastily converted, with a bed and a minimal set of equipment crammed inside. Compared to the roaring chaos of the hallways, it was almost deathly silent here, broken only by the steady beep of a cardiac monitor. And on the bed lay Julian Croft. That was the name on the plastic bracelet hastily clasped on his right, less injured wrist. The first thing I noticed was his apparent calm. Against the backdrop of the horrors I'd seen in the last few hours, he looked almost peaceful. He was asleep, or at least he seemed to be. His long, dark eyelashes didn't flutter. His breathing, judging by the slight movement of his chest, was even. But this tranquility was a deceptive mask stretched over unimaginable agony. His face, or rather the right half of it, was covered in minor cuts and scrapes, but the left side was a mangled ruin. His eye was swollen into a narrow slit oozing serous fluid. The skin on his cheek and temple was charred to a grotesque parchment-like state. Yet, despite this, the underlying structure of his face was well-defined, handsome even. Occasionally, a faint grimace of pain would flicker across his lips, a brief twitch of muscle, as if, even in sleep, his body couldn't forget the nightmare it had endured. I carefully lifted the edge of the sheet. What I saw made me recoil. He was one of those special patients whispered about in the break rooms, survivors from the very heart of the blast, from sectors of Area 51 strictly forbidden to regular personnel. And their injuries were unusual. The word spun in my head as I examined Julian Croft, and with every passing minute, it seemed more and more fitting. Julian Croft's medical chart, or rather the hastily filled-out sheet Wallace had shoved at me, didn't say much. Age, 26, rank, specialist, unit, classified, location of recovery, cryogenic storage, sector Delta 9. The last few words were underlined in thick red ink. Cryogenic storage. For what? Biological weapon samples, or something worse? A chill ran down my spine despite the stuffiness of the small room. His injuries were described in detail, albeit in dry medical jargon, on the reverse side. Left eye, total loss of vision, third-degree burn to the cornea and retina. The entire left side of his body, extensive thermal and chemical burns ranging from third to fourth degree. The charred skin was sloughing off in places, revealing glistening muscle tissue and even bone. His left arm had been amputated above the elbow. The stump, tightly bandaged, looked unnaturally thin. The surgeons must have decided it was unsalvageable, the damage too extensive. I gently touched the bandages. They were dry, with no sign of fresh bleeding, but a strange, faint coldness emanated from the stump, a stark contrast to the heat of the burned skin nearby. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Across the entire affected left side of his body, from his hairline to his ankle, a strange violet pigmentation was beginning to spread. It wasn't like a normal bruise or a hematoma from an impact. This was a deep, vibrant, almost internally glowing violet, as if a rare poisonous ink had been spilled beneath a thin layer of parchment-like skin. It spread in uneven patches, with darker, almost black veins that resembled the roots of some sinister plant digging into his flesh. The skin in these areas felt strange to the touch, not hot with inflammation, but cool, almost marble-like, and with a rubbery elasticity. It was unlike any symptom I had ever seen. It reminded me of textbook images of rare fungal infections or the effects of unknown toxins, but even those were nothing like this. This violet color was alive. It seemed to breathe, slowly but inexorably conquering more of his body. I hooked Julian up to the monitors. His vitals were surprisingly stable, aside from a slightly elevated heart rate, which was understandable given his condition. Blood pressure was normal. Oxygen saturation was 96% on room air. But when I looked at the blood test results from the rapid analysis lab, my confusion only deepened. There were no signs of the internal bleeding that this horrific violet color might suggest. In fact, his hemoglobin levels weren't just stable, they were high and, according to a note from an hour ago, still climbing. They were rising by several points every hour, which was completely impossible for a patient with such extensive burns and trauma. Normally, we fought for every 1/10 of a percentage point, transfusing liters of blood. But here his body seemed to be generating blood at an incredible rate. Soon, Dr. Simon Ware entered the room, one of the lead specialists on the base, a man with a tired face and eyes that held a permanent look of anxiety. He wasn't a military doctor in the traditional sense, more of a scientist in a lab coat assigned to the hospital to oversee the special cases. He gave me a silent nod, quickly scanned the monitors and Julian's chart. "Nurse Keller." His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "This patient is on a special treatment protocol, experimental drugs. The names won't mean anything to you. They're classified. Your job is to strictly monitor the infusion and report any changes in his condition to me immediately. No questions, no notes beyond what I specify. That's an order from high command." His gaze was heavy, allowing no argument. There was something more than just professional severity in it. Deep in his pupils, a flicker of fear, or perhaps guilt, shone through. And the drugs were indeed strange. An orderly from a special department brought them on a separate cart, escorted by 2 armed soldiers. These weren't standard bags of saline or antibiotics. They were small, no more than 250 milliliters, in thick, opaque bags. But the liquid inside, it was a vivid, almost fluorescent green. Even in the dim light of the room, it emitted a faint but noticeable glow, casting greenish reflections on the walls and ceiling. I connected the IV, set the infusion rate Ware had specified. It was shockingly high, almost a steady stream. The liquid flowed with a quiet hiss down the tube and into Julian's vein. Several hours passed. I checked on him regularly. The violet on his skin seemed to have deepened, and the greenish veins within it grew brighter. And that's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light from the IV bag, but then I looked closer. Julian's skin, especially on the damaged left side, had begun to glow faintly from within, with the same ethereal green light as the drugs. The glow was weak, only visible if I turned off the overhead light, but it was there. And one more thing. When I leaned in to adjust his pillow, I heard it. A low-frequency hum emanating from his body. It was like the thrum of a transformer or the vibration of some complex mechanism working inside him. This sound wasn't detectable with a stethoscope as a murmur or a rattle in his lungs. It was different. It was something I felt more with my whole body, a slight tremor in my fingertips when I touched his skin, and an unpleasant pressure in my ears. I tried to look up drugs with code names like XN7 or Spectre Gamma in our medical databases, but of course I found nothing. The secrecy of Area 51 extended to its medicines. All of it was deeply unsettling. What kind of substance was flowing through this poor man's veins, and what was it turning him into? Julian Croft was being kept under deep sedation. The official reason was to minimize his suffering from the monstrous burns and injuries. "You don't feel pain in your sleep," Dr. Ware had repeated didactically when I'd once again suggested the possibility of lowering the sedative dose to assess his neurological status. It seemed like the most humane solution for his condition. However, any sedation, no matter how humane, has its downside, its risks that every medical professional knows all too well. If you overdo it with drugs that suppress the central nervous system, the patient's breathing slows, becomes shallow, and their heart rate drops. And when those vital signs cross a critical threshold, you have to bring them back urgently, pull them out of the medically induced sleep. Otherwise, the brain will start to suffer from hypoxia, and the heart could stop altogether. That fine line between alleviating suffering and threatening life always created an internal tension for me, especially with a special patient like Julian, whose condition was already one big question mark. My shift was about halfway through. Night had fallen on the Nevada desert, bringing a temporary lull to the hospital's frantic pace. Most of the emergency surgeries were over. The wounded had been distributed to rooms, and the hallways of Nevada Med no longer resembled a battlefield. Dim nightlights cast long, dancing shadows, and the occasional sound, a patient coughing in a nearby room, the squeak of a duty nurse's cart, only emphasized the oppressive silence. I was sitting at the small desk in Julian's room, filling out paperwork, occasionally glancing at the monitors. His vitals had been depressingly stable in their abnormality. Hemoglobin continued to creep up, and the violet patches on his skin seemed to have spread another half-inch. The faint green glow of his skin and the quiet, low-frequency hum from his body had become a familiar background. Suddenly, one of the indicators on the cardiac monitor began to flash red. Respiratory rate. It was dropping. 10 breaths a minute. 9. 8. I put down my pen and went to the bed. Julian was breathing slowly, with long, frightening pauses between shallow breaths. His chest barely moved. I took his hand. The radial pulse was weak, thready. Julian, can you hear me?" I gently shook his good shoulder, but he didn't respond. His face remained serene, except for a slight bluish tinge appearing around his lips. I quickly put on my stethoscope, pressing the cold diaphragm to his chest. His heartbeat was slow, muffled, the beats echoing in my ears with alarming lethargy. I started counting. 42 beats per minute. 40. 39. He was crashing. But before I could fully concentrate on the count, I heard it again, only this time more clearly than before. A slick, wet, squirming sound coming from somewhere deep inside his chest. It wasn't like the crackles of pneumonia or pulmonary edema. It was something else, something alive, writhing, as if something slippery and wet, like an eel, were slowly turning over beneath his ribs. The sound lasted only a couple of seconds, then silence fell again, broken only by Julian's rare, shallow breaths. I imagined it. The thought flashed through my mind. Just an artifact, or I'm losing my mind from exhaustion and this whole nightmare. I shook my head, trying to banish the illusion, and focused again on the monitors. His pulse continued to fall. 38. I lunged for the infusion pump, which was feeding a continuous stream of that secret green cocktail mixed with a powerful sedative into his vein. My fingers found the pause button and slammed it down. The drug flow stopped. For a few seconds, the machine was silent. And then, as if realizing it had been interrupted, it let out a piercing, ear-splitting alarm. That sound, like the cry of a hungry, abandoned infant, echoed through the quiet room, bouncing off the walls and stabbing at my eardrums. It was a distress signal, a desperate shriek from a machine stating that something had gone terribly wrong, that the life of the patient connected to it was hanging by a thread. I snatched an ampule of naloxone, the antidote that could quickly reverse the deep sedation, and a syringe from the desk. I had to act immediately. Every second counted. With trembling hands, I dialed the on-call physician's number on my service phone. The rings seemed to last an eternity, each one pounding in my temples like a hammer. Finally, Dr. Weir's sleepy, slightly irritated voice came on the line. I quickly, stumbling over my words, described the situation. To my surprise, he didn't ask any clarifying questions. "I'll be there in a minute," he said curtly and hung up. And indeed, less than 60 seconds later, the door to the room swung open, and Weir, adjusting the white coat thrown over a rumpled shirt, strode in. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night, but his gaze was sharp and focused. "Report, Keller." His voice was steady, almost colorless. "Respiratory rate is 8 per minute, shallow. Pulse dropped to 40, thready. I paused the sedative and the green cocktail infusion. On auscultation, heart tones are muffled and slow. Breath sounds are clear. No crackles, although..." I hesitated, remembering that strange, slithering sound. Should I mention it? Would he dismiss it as the ramblings of an exhausted nurse? Although I thought I heard an artifact, it was probably nothing, I added quickly. What's his saturation? Weir, ignoring my last comment, was already leaning over Julian, clipping a pulse oximeter to his finger. The numbers on the small screen flickered ominously at 82%. I put him on a non-rebreather mask at 15 liters a minute as soon as I noticed the RR drop, but his SATs are still in the low 80s, sir, I replied, pointing to the mask pressed tightly over Julian's face. Underneath it, his lips had taken on a distinct bluish hue. I held the syringe of naloxone, ready to inject the drug at a moment's notice. Sir, I believe we need to administer the reversal agent immediately. He's critical. We're risking irreversible brain damage from hypoxia. Dr. Ware, meanwhile, had taken out his stethoscope and was listening intently to Julian's chest. His face was a mask of extreme concentration. The seconds stretched on torturously. I expected to hear the command, "Adding Asterit," but instead, he straightened up and gave me a strange, heavy look. His eyes lacked the professional concern I was used to seeing in doctors in such situations. There was something else there, a mixture of determination and almost desperation. "Give him a few more minutes, nurse," he said quietly but firmly. "Let's see if he can bring his own sats up on pure oxygen." I couldn't believe my ears. "Sir, are you sure? With this level of hypoxia, every minute counts. We're violating every protocol. This is actively harming the patient." My voice trembled with indignation and disbelief. I knew that if his blood oxygen level stayed below 90%, let alone at a critically low number like 82 for too long, it would inevitably lead to irreversible damage to his cerebral cortex. The medical principle of do no harm was screaming inside me. "Restart the infusion, Keller." Ware cut me off, his face hardening into a stone mask. He pointed at the infusion pump, which was still emitting its shrill alarm. "Continue the drugs as prescribed. Keep him sedated. Monitor his blood pressure and overall condition closely. If his saturation drops below 80, notify me immediately." His gaze was icy, leaving no room for discussion. Something else flickered in it, a fleeting glint of fear quickly suppressed by an iron will. It was as if he wasn't afraid of Julian dying from hypoxia, but of something else, something much worse. "But sir, this is—" I tried to object, but he had already turned and was walking swiftly toward the exit. "Follow your orders, nurse," he threw over his shoulder without looking back, disappearing through the door and leaving me alone in the silence, broken only by the monitor's beeping and the pump's alarm. I stood there, thunderstruck, clutching the now useless syringe of naloxone. An order. But this was an order to kill a patient. Slowly but surely. What the hell was going on here? "What the hell?" I whispered into the deafening silence, now dominated by the insistent shriek of the infusion pump demanding my attention. Dr. Ware's words echoed in my head, cold and merciless. Restart the infusion? Keep him sedated while he's suffocated? My brain refused to process it. This was beyond a protocol violation. It was a direct path to a lethal outcome for Julian Croft. My fingers hovered over the start button on the IV stand. One press, and I would become an accomplice to what felt like premeditated murder. My nursing license, my oath, my conscience, all of it screamed in protest. I couldn't do it. I physically could not force myself to push that button. The risk of losing my job, even facing a court-martial for disobeying an order in an emergency, all of it paled in comparison to the thought that I would, with my own hands, end this man's life, no matter how strange and frightening his condition was. Instead of blindly obeying, I made a decision. I needed a second opinion. Somewhere in this hospital, there had to be another doctor, someone who hadn't lost their last shred of common sense and medical ethics. I slipped out of Julian's room, leaving the infusion pump to continue its insistent wail, a reminder of the ticking clock on his life. The corridors of Nevada Med still looked like a disaster movie set, though the peak of the chaos seemed to have passed. But doctors and nurses were still rushing around like wind-up toys, their faces gray with exhaustion and stress. Wounded men lay groaning on gurneys lining the walls, waiting for their turn in surgery or just an empty bed. The air was thick with the smells of blood, antiseptics, and human suffering. I scanned the nearest stations. It was bedlam everywhere. The chance of pulling a doctor aside for even a minute seemed non-existent. At the far end of the hall, I saw Dr. Kim, a cardiologist. She was hunched over a patient on a gurney, performing CPR with desperate force. Two nurses scurried around her, one trying to get an IV line started, the other prepping a defibrillator. Blood was everywhere. On the sheet, the floor, Dr. Kim's scrubs. "Clear!" she shouted, and the patient's body arched off the gurney. The monitor beside him continued to show a flat line. My instincts took over. Julian was in critical condition, but right here, right now, another person was actively dying and needed immediate help. Triage in a mass casualty event is a brutal necessity. I ran toward them. "What do you need, doctor?" "Keller! Thank God!" Dr. Kim gasped, not pausing her compressions. "I need another set of hands. Bag him, quickly. And I need someone to call a code blue for the whole hospital." I lunged for the wall, where a red button for the crash team was located, and slammed my hand on it. A broken, urgent alarm, code blue, blared through the hospital. Then I grabbed the nearby crash cart and wheeled it closer. With hands trembling from adrenaline, I hooked up the oxygen tank to the ambu bag, cranked the flow to the maximum 20 liters per minute, and fitted the mask over the patient's face. His lips were a dark blue, almost black. I began to rhythmically squeeze the bag, forcing life-giving oxygen into his lungs, watching his chest rise and fall. Dr. Kim continued the chest compressions. The saturation numbers on the monitor slowly, agonizingly, began to crawl up, from 60 to 65, then to 70. It was a desperate fight for a life, and every second felt like an eternity. Finally, after a few minutes that felt like hours, the crash team sprinted down the hall. They quickly and efficiently took over from us. Dr. Kim, breathing heavily, gave me a grateful nod. I was able to step away. My heart was pounding in my throat. I had saved one life, or at least given him a chance. But at what cost? How much precious time had I lost, leaving Julian alone? With a heavy sense of dread, I started running back to room 7B. The hallway seemed endless. What would I find? Was I too late? Or had Weir's order and my delay already done their dark work? Fear gripped my chest in an icy vice. But not even in my most horrific imaginings could I have pictured what awaited me behind the door to Julian Croft's room. I pushed open the door to room 7B and froze on the threshold, unable to believe my eyes. The room which just moments ago had been a relatively sterile medical space, had been transformed into an arena for something monstrous, something beyond description. The first thing I saw was Julian. He was no longer lying peacefully. His body was racked with violent convulsions, arching on the bed as if being broken by invisible forces. Muffled, gurgling, inhuman sounds escaped his throat, more like the rasp of a drowning man than a scream. But the most terrifying thing was that his mouth, his nose, the entire lower half of his face was covered, no, consumed, by something alive and pulsating. It was a mass of writhing violet tendrils like thick, fleshy vines or tentacles that were tightly wrapped around his head, squirming and twitching. The source of this nightmare was obvious: the stump of his amputated left arm. From it, as if from the mouth of a volcano, new violet shoots were erupting. They grew with an incredible, unnatural speed, like a time-lapse nature documentary. But these were not plants. This was something predatory, aggressive. In the few minutes I had been gone, they had managed to entwine not only Julian himself, but also a large part of the bed, the pillow, the sheets. The tips of the vines quivered as if sniffing the air, exploring the space around them. They were the same deep, sinister violet as the patches on his skin. But now the color seemed even more alive, more menacing. Dark, almost black veins pulsed on their surface, and the entire mass throbbed quietly but palpably, like a single, giant organism. The infusion pump, which I had left alarming, was still shrieking, but now its sound was drowned out by other, more gruesome noises. Julian's gurgling gasps and the quiet, wet rustle of the growing vines as they slithered over each other and the bed. One of the thickest vines, as thick as my arm, had already reached the metal IV pole and was beginning to slowly wrap around it, squeezing with visible force. Suddenly, with incredible inhuman power, that vine and several smaller ones that joined it ripped the pole towards them. Metal shrieked. The pole, which weighed at least 20 pounds, was torn from its base as if it were made of cardboard. And in the next instant, it was hurled like a spear across the room, straight into the window. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces with a deafening crash, and a gust of night desert air burst into the room, bringing with it the smell of dust and sagebrush. "What the hell was that?" came a frightened male voice from somewhere down the hall. Probably one of the guards or staff who heard the glass break. My own voice seemed to be trapped in my throat. I gasped for air several times, trying to scream, but only a strangled croak came out. Finally, I managed to force out a word. "Help." It sounded pathetic, thin, nowhere near as loud as I wanted. But it was all I was capable of in that moment, paralyzed by the horror and unreality of it all. That cry seemed to break some invisible barrier, and events began to unfold with even greater, nightmarish speed. The instant my belated cry for help left my lips, Julian, or the thing he had become, abruptly stopped convulsing. His body went limp for a second, and then his eyes snapped open. The whites were gone. In their place swirled a horrifying, living violet mist, the exact color of the vines that had consumed him. There were no pupils, no irises, just this active, churning violet that radiated an inhuman intelligence and boundless malice. The writhing vines, which until that moment had seemed to grow chaotically, suddenly tensed as if on command. With incredible speed, they lifted Julian's body off the bed. He hung in the center of the room, about 3 feet off the floor, supported by this monstrous growth like a puppet on strings. His remaining right arm dangled limply. His head was tilted slightly, and those violet eyes, they were fixed directly on me. There was nothing human in that gaze, only cold, calculating menace. Before I could even flinch, several thin but incredibly strong vines shot out from the main mass enveloping him. They lunged at me like enraged vipers, so fast I didn't even have time to raise my hands to defend myself. One wrapped around my neck, instantly cutting off my air. 2 others seized my arms, squeezing with such force I heard my own bones creak. The pain was sharp, searing, but it was immediately drowned out by the rising terror of suffocation. I tried to scream, but only a faint wheeze escaped my throat. The vines were cold and slick to the touch, and they gave off a faint, nauseating smell of rotting organic matter and damp earth. I watched as my fingers began to turn blue before my eyes, then started to take on that same ghastly, dark violet hue I had seen on Julian's skin. It was only minutes ago that he had seemed like just a badly injured patient, but now that felt like another lifetime, another era. The tingling in my fingertips gave way to an agonizing numbness. My vision began to dim, and a roaring filled my ears. I was losing consciousness. It was at that moment, when I had all but lost hope, that the door to the room crashed open. In the doorway stood Dr. Soto, one of the surgeons I had worked with earlier that day. His face was a mask of utter confusion, which instantly morphed into pure terror when he saw the scene inside the room. "What in God's name?" he breathed, and then his voice broke into a high-pitched scream of horror. He stumbled back, but before he could take another step, he screamed again, this time with different words. Words that sent an even greater chill down my spine. "Quarantine! Lock down the sector! We have a bloom!" A bloom. So they knew. This had happened before. His warning was the last thing he ever said. One of the vines, detaching from the mass-holding Julian, shot toward Soto with lightning speed. It pierced his skull from the side, entering just above his ear with a sickening, wet crunch. The doctor's scream cut off mid-syllable. He froze for an instant, his eyes glazing over, then collapsed bonelessly to the floor. Immediately, his body began to be entwined by new, thinner violet shoots that seemed to be growing directly out of the floor. They quickly covered him, entering his mouth, nostrils, ears, as if trying to consume and assimilate him. Suddenly, a new siren blared throughout the hospital. Not a code blue, but something else, more sinister. A low and sustained wail. The room was flooded with the pulsating red light of emergency beacons on the ceiling. This deafening alarm and the change in lighting seemed to momentarily distract the creature that Julian had become. The grip of the vines on my neck loosened slightly, and I was able to suck in a ragged breath of air. I looked at the floating figure. His violet eyes were no longer fixed on me, but on the shattered window, through which the cool night wind was now gusting, bringing the sense of the desert. It seemed the desire to escape, to break free, had overcome its immediate urge to kill me. After a few endless seconds that felt like an eternity, the creature abruptly released its tentacles. I collapsed to the floor in a heap, coughing violently and gasping for precious air. My vision swam, and my throat burned like fire. Lifting my head, I watched in horror as the Julian creature moved slowly toward the window. The vines covering its body clung to the walls and ceiling, pulling it along like a giant spider. In a moment it was at the opening, and then with an easy push, it slipped outside and into the darkness. Behind it, writhing and intertwining, followed the entire horrifying mass of violet tendrils, disappearing into the night. As soon as the creature vanished through the window frame, a gust of cold desert wind burst into the room, throwing a handful of sand and fine glass shards in my face. I squeezed my eyes shut, instinctively shielding them with my hand. When I could see again, the door slammed open, and armed figures in full hazmat gear, looking like astronauts from a horror film, appeared in the doorway. Their faces were hidden behind the thick visors of their helmets, but the way they froze on the threshold showed that even they, trained for anything, were shocked by what they saw. Dr. Soto's body, already half consumed by the violet mass, and the remnants of the tendrils, still squirming on the floor and walls, were a truly nightmarish sight. Sector 7B, target has vacated the premises. Initiating sterilization protocol. A voice distorted by a speaker boomed from one of the soldiers. Two of them stepped forward, aiming the nozzles of massive devices that looked like futuristic fire extinguishers at the remaining tendrils. With a loud hiss, jets of icy white vapor shot out. Wherever the cryogenic agent hit, the violet growths instantly frosted over, became brittle as glass, and shattered with a crack. Within minutes, the room was sanitized. All that was left of the ghastly vegetation was a pile of icy shards covered in a white dust. They led me out of the room, shivering and coughing from the residual cryo-fog. I was alive, but the world would never be the same. The scars left on my neck and wrists from the death grip of the violet vines still burn and itch in cold weather, a permanent reminder of that night. They are the undeniable proof of what I went through, despite all the subsequent attempts by the government and the military to cover up the incident, to dismiss it as mass hysteria caused by the explosion or the effects of an unknown chemical leak. My attempts to tell the truth, to inform the public of what I saw, what Julian Croft became, and that this creature, this bloom, as Soto had called it, was now free, led only to my dishonorable discharge from the armed forces for disseminating false information prejudicial to good order and discipline, and violating security protocols. I was subjected to countless interrogations, where men in severe suits with stone faces tried for hours to convince me that I had imagined it all, that I was in a state of shock. When that didn't work, the threats began. Hints of treason, of special, very quiet, very deep prisons, somewhere right here under the Nevada sands, from which no one ever returns. But I don't care anymore. They can lock me up, declare me insane, erase my name from every record. It doesn't matter. Only one thing matters: that the truth gets out, that people know, so they can be ready. Because from the depths of Area 51, from its secret labs and cryogenic vaults, something has escaped. Something ancient, or something man-made. But in any case, something monstrous and hostile. It knows how to adapt. It knows how to consume. It knows how to grow stronger. And I know. I feel it in every cell of my body, in every scar on my skin. It won't stop. It won't rest until all of us have been assimilated. Until the whole world is painted in that same horrific, deathly violet. It's already out there somewhere, in the vastness of the desert. Or maybe it's already among us, hiding, waiting, and preparing to strike again. And we must be ready.